Welcome to the Center for Audit Quality's Profession in Focus today on going concern in the COVID-19 environment. I'd like to thank my guests, KPMG's Jackie Daylor and RSM's Rich Davisson, for joining me here today. I'd now like to turn it over to our guests to introduce themselves. Jackie, let's start with you.
Thanks, Yuri. My name's Jackie Daylor. I'm the National Managing Partner of Audit Quality and Professional Practice at KPMG, and I'm pleased to have the opportunity to be here today.
Glad to have you joining us here today, Jackie. Next, I'd like to turn it over to Rich to introduce himself.
Thanks, Yuri. I'm Rich Davisson. I am a partner in our National Professional Standards Group at RSM and also the director of the Northeast Regional Professional Practice Office.
Thank you, Jackie and Rich. So, Jackie, to start with, I know there's been a lot of discussion in the media recently around going concern, which is not a new concept. Can you summarize for our audience the concept of going concern, how our clients think about it, and why it may be in the news more now with respect to COVID-19?
Sure, Yuri. The accounting standards, specifically ASC 20540, have a presumption that entities will be able to meet their obligations when they become due. So that's the going concern presumption. And management has to make an assertion related to this as they prepare the financial statements. And if there's substantial doubt about the entity's ability to meet its obligations, certain disclosures in the notes to the financial statements are required. Whether management's plans actually alleviate that substantial doubt or don't alleviate the substantial doubt. Before 2017, the going concern assessment was only a requirement for auditors, but now it has also become management's responsibility. And the current economic environment, it's the first time since the Great Recession when many entities have had to face significant economic challenges, which has brought the going concern accounting standard top of mind for entities, auditors, and regulators. COVID-19 has impacted supply chains, workforces, access to credit, and certainly has changed consumer behavior in a number of industries. And those impacts may call into question an entity's ability to meet an obligation or other factors that may give rise to going concern considerations.
Thank you, Jackie. So, Rich, I suspect there could be a number of companies out there that only had a couple weeks of COVID-19 in their Q1 results, and so they may be considering taking a closer look at this in Q2. Can you remind us of what the requirements are for assessing going concern for public companies and for auditors?
You're right, Yuri. That's exactly where we're at. And the WHO, as you mentioned, declared the pandemic in early March, and then stay-at-home orders came within a few weeks after that. And so the real impact hit the second quarter instead of the first quarter, but we had a little bit going on in the first quarter. So ASC 20540 requires management to evaluate the entity's ability to continue as a going concern. And the evaluation should be based on all conditions that are either known or knowable at the time of the assessment, which is at the period end. Now, when management is doing this assessment at each reporting year end, it's important to note they don't just do this on an annual basis, but they need to do it for their quarters. And they need to take into account all of the considerations out there. So when we think about that, we need to think about the qualitative considerations and the quantitative considerations. You need to look at everything that's available in order to assess this. So it's also to make sure, important to understand that management needs to be looking at this in a way of preparing forecasts and things such as that, which we will talk about a little more further on. So when you think about ASC 20540, that is the same as it was prior to it, but there's a lot more for management to think about because of the factors that are going on in the world. Now, the second part of this is the auditor's assessment, which is in PCAOB AS 2415. And the auditor has the obligation to look and make sure that the company can continue as a going concern for a reasonable period of time, not to exceed 1 year, based once again on all those relevant conditions that are out there. So we need to make sure that we're looking at management's assessment and then making our own assessment and agreeing what management has done, as well as making sure that management has disclosed what's necessary under the standards. One of the things that's really important to note through all of this is the fact that neither management's requirements or the auditor's requirements have changed throughout all of this. The standards are still the same, and even though COVID has made it much more difficult for us to assess these things, the standards haven't changed and our requirements under them will be the same.
So now that we have an understanding of the going concern requirements, let's move to observations from calendar Q1 reporting cycle. Jackie, can you provide us some observations on your client experiences with going concern assessments and maybe what were some of the key challenges as they worked through this in Q1?
Well, first of all, COVID-19 isn't necessarily an indicator of substantial doubt. Some entities saw growth during COVID-19. I mean, think of this video call on Zoom and the impacts on video call businesses. But certainly, many entities and industries, whether that be retailers, hospitality, restaurants, could be facing challenges that were brought on by the COVID-19 pandemic. And those challenges have to be considered in the forecasts and ultimately going concern assessments in the look forward period. One of the key challenges clients faced in the first quarter of 2020 was forecasting the impact of the pandemic on their business. How long would it last? When would customers feel safe to return to a retail store? When is it safe for employees to go back to the store or to the office? Another key challenge that we saw was understanding impacts of COVID-19 on debt agreements. For example, whether any material adverse change clauses get triggered and what would be the resulting impact to liquidity. If substantial doubt is raised, a significant challenge is determining whether management's plans are feasible and probable of being implemented, and whether those plans will actually mitigate the substantial doubt being seen. And as you can imagine, there is significant judgment when dealing with a plan. No one can predict the future, and of course that brings with it a need for professional skepticism.
Thank you, Jackie. Rich, anything that you've observed that you'd like to add to that?
Well, I agree with Jackie in regards to the primary challenge related to this is management's forecasting. And one of the things that we're used to seeing in forecasting is quite often management will do one scenario of forecasting. Now, in regards to that, in this situation, there's so many unknowns that management may be required to look at multiple scenarios. And so the forecasting and the assumptions thereof become that much more critical. The other thing that I'd like to point out, whereas Jackie talked about the current debt environment and what's happening with a client's debt in regards to whether their banks have the subjective clauses or not, is also there were federal programs out there that were just starting out in the first quarter, and we didn't know much about them. And so by the time the second quarter is over, many of those programs that were going on are operational, even though there's still some confusion around them. They're operational. Companies would have been able to obtain their borrowings, and hopefully there's been some great accounting literature and advice going on out there in how to account for those. And then lastly, we also observed companies assessing the ICFR at the end of the first quarter, and with the stay-at-home orders, that ICFR and the impact stay-at-home orders had on ICFR was just coming into focus. And so clients also need to assess their ICFR at the end of the quarter and be looking at whether there were changes that need to be disclosed, as well as the effectiveness of the ICFR over the going concern assumption.
Great points, Rich. So Jackie, I want to come back to you on your comments around the challenges of forecasting the impacts of the pandemic. How did your clients overcome such challenges in the first quarter? And is there anything you can share that your clients learned through this process that they wish they knew when they started?
Well, I think a key point for clients is to start the process early. And really that begins with understanding contractual arrangements, including debt agreements. If debt's coming due within 12 months from issuance of the financials and can't be repaid through operating cash flow, that conversation with lenders needs to start early to avoid any last minute surprises. And of course, a dialogue with the auditors is important. Auditors should have insight into potential disclosure requirements and the requirements for auditing or reviewing at the quarters the going concern assessment.
Those are helpful points, Jackie. Now, Rich, I thought you could spend a few minutes on what you've observed with respect to your clients' Q1 experiences and how that may have impacted their approach for Q2 with respect to their going concern assessments.
Sure. Now, based on the fact that another 3 months have happened and the initial plans and survival mode has hopefully turned for most entities into this being, while it's a change, we're getting into a normal operating cycle as far as things are becoming more routine. Therefore, the ability to project and the clarity of thought around the duration of this, as well as published information as to what's going on, allows us to have better formed assumptions in regards to our forecast. Although it doesn't hurt to remind that history may still not be a good predictor of what is going to happen in the future. But many companies are seeing some return to normalcy. I also think we're seeing that our clients are more prepared to understand the going concern assessments and continue to be challenged in a greater manner than in the past. Hopefully, we've been talking to our clients about understanding this, and after the first quarter, they understand the critical nature of this going concern assessment and that it's not simply the qualitative assessment that we might have been able to do in the past because there's so many factors that are entering into it.
So now I want to shift gears to observations from Q1 with respect to going concern considerations for auditors. Jackie, could you describe for us some of the challenges experienced by auditors to date around going concern that you've observed?
Auditing forecasts in this environment is certainly challenging, given the uncertainties that we've talked about related to COVID-19. I mean, Rich has talked about management's challenges with forecasts, and in many cases, companies are weighing multiple scenarios as they develop those forecasts. What's key is that all of those forecasts need to align among the many evaluations done throughout the financial statements. And auditing management plans, if those are meant to mitigate the substantial doubt, is really important. And there's significant judgments in those plans many times. And sometimes those plans may be outside the control of the company. The challenges that we experienced as auditors were largely around the concepts and conclusions of management plans, whether they're probable in alleviating the factors or conditions that gave rise to that substantial doubt. And of course, for purposes of being able to conclude that management plans were probable, the plans must be in management's control. And that's a high hurdle and requires careful analysis, professional skepticism, and oftentimes difficult conclusions and conversations. Management, of course, has to do their analysis first and have controls around their process. And just speaking of internal controls, controls related to going concern assessments are now being done remotely. So really critical for management is to demonstrate the operating effectiveness of those controls in the remote environment.
Rich, is there anything else you'd like to add in terms of challenges experienced by auditors related to going concern?
Yes, I agree with Jackie's observations. And most of us, especially in the workforce, have never seen a pandemic like this, so it's unprecedented. And in Q1, it seemed like all of us were drinking from a fire hose with all the information that we had coming at us. We had accounting standards such as going concern and impairment and things that we may not have had to deal with on certain clients until after COVID-19 hit. And so there were many things going on that we were somewhat caught unaware and caught we needed to do more in regards to that. There were also challenges getting clients to understand why they needed to fully understand and dedicate resources to the exercise of good accounting in relation to ASC 205 and other standards that require their time in economic downturns. This was a point that's been recently emphasized by the Office of the Chief Accountant. Back on June 25th, the OCA discussed the requirements of the going concern disclosures and what they expect to see from registrants in the second quarter. And I think that this is also important for companies to look at and make sure that they are fulfilling their requirements as expected by their regulator.
Thanks, Rich. In light of these challenges, is there anything you'd recommend our auditors watching consider around going concern as we continue to move through Q2 reporting season?
Certainly. The thing that Jackie talked about and we've touched on in this call, and I don't think can be emphasized enough, is communication. In the first quarter, you already knew most of the activity that had gone on through the work you had done in your audits. And therefore, Q2 is something where what's happened since COVID hit is what you have to talk to your client about to gain an understanding. And so being sure that you're having those conversations early on and having thorough conversations and making sure that those conversations include tough conversations about what the company might need to do if their projections are not detailed enough or if things aren't necessarily in management's control, as Jackie talked about earlier. One of the things that we see in clients is when clients come to survival mode, you tend to have transactions and other things that aren't necessarily in the normal course of business, so they're more complex. And therefore, you need to dedicate more time into understanding how those impact the accounting and your review on that quarter. As I said previously also, his history isn't necessarily the best predictor, so being sure that you're looking at all the information out there and make sure that your client understands what ASC 205 actually means. And when I say that, there's a colloquial understanding and a technical understanding of what's out there in ASC 205, and making sure we transition any client's colloquial understanding and our teams into that technical understanding as it becomes more impactful is very critical. And then lastly, Jackie discussed earlier with lenders. Where is management in discussion with their lenders? How does this impact the debt? What's going on in that regard? Are there forbearance, et cetera? So those are the things that I think just tip of the iceberg people need to talk about with their clients.
Those are great recommendations, Rich. Jackie, is there anything you'd like to add?
I agree fully with Rich that starting the dialogue with clients early and educating ourselves and our clients is key to getting the going concern standard application right. And KPMG actually just published a going concern handbook, which is certainly helpful to our auditors and clients, but it's also publicly available. I'd also add that while there are many areas where increased professional skepticism may be required, estimates is a consistent area where increased professional skepticism is particularly important given estimation uncertainty and the potential for management bias in things like forecasts that we've spent a lot of time talking about. Auditing forecasts in this environment is certainly challenging given the uncertainties with COVID-19, and it just warrants that additional professional skepticism as we've discussed. Last, I wanted to mention that auditors should be performing risk assessment continuously, especially in an environment like this that is changing and additional fraud risk factors may arise as folks are working remotely, and just staying attentive to all that becomes incredibly important in risk assessment.
Well, this has been a very informative discussion and well-timed as we work through calendar Q2 2020 reporting season. Thank you, Jackie and Rich, for taking the time here to share your insights on this episode of Profession in Focus.
Thanks for including me, Yuri.
Great to be here, Yuri. Thank you.